Hi, I'm Celeste Roseberry McKibben. I'm really excited to be with you to talk about practical assessment and intervention strategies for English language learners with language impairment. We're going to cover a lot of ground and have some fun. So as a disclosure statement, Asha is paying me for this presentation, and I do receive royalties for purchases of my book. So the information is cited with permission from my publisher, and I'm very thankful that he's generously allowed Asha to scan some materials for you that are very practical and that you can begin to use literally tomorrow morning. So I've got a YouTube channel as well, and I have some demonstration videos on there. We're not going to have time to look at them in this particular session, but they're actual demos with real kids, and so I hope that those will be helpful for you as you review the information. So in terms of an outline for this presentation, we're going to cram a lot into our 30 minutes. We're going to introduce, talk about general assessment considerations, go over legal issues, skim over issues in standardized testing. And mostly what I want to do is talk about practical strategies and materials for informal assessment. We'll touch on intervention, looking at instructional continuum, language of intervention, and vocabulary and Common Core. So by way of introduction, my goal for you with this video is to come away with an absolute minimum of 3 new ideas that you can incorporate into your work settings with your students. So we're going to discuss materials and strategies for all levels, preschool, elementary, and adolescent, from any language background. So a little bit of my story real quick. I was born in Southern California, and when I was 6, my family went to the Philippines, where my parents served as Baptist missionaries for 10 years. So for a couple of years, I was the only white kid in the elementary school, and then my parents sent me to boarding school for grades 5 and 7 through 12. When we came back to the States, I was a college freshman, 17 years old, and going through a lot of cultural adjustments. So in the Philippines, this is what it looked like. We lived in the barrios. It was very, very rural. No phones, TV, electricity, any of that for some of that time, and it was awesome. It was really a fun way to grow up. So my parents and sisters and I spoke standard English at home. We spoke Ojonganon in the barrio. Church was in Hiligaynon. I studied Tagalog in school and then German and Spanish later. So all of those experiences gave me a real empathy for children who speak other languages. And then we were also fairly low income. My dad was a minister making $300 a month for a family of 6. And then coming back to the States, my parents had 4 teenage daughters and nothing. And so when I became a speech pathologist, my passion was serving low-income, diverse children, and it still is. I really, really love what I do. So I was with Elk Grove Unified for a while, and then I got a job a little closer to home. At my school, we had about 1,000 kids, most of whom were children of color on welfare, with over 30 different languages represented. And in my district, we had 80 to 90 different language groups, many of whom were kids from low-income families. So in 1 week, these were all the languages I assessed, and so I'm really, again, into practical strategies for diverse students from a lot of different backgrounds. So now I'm a part-time itinerant speech-language pathologist for San Juan Unified, a lot closer to my home. So I work at the university full-time as a professor, Monday through Thursday, and then every other Friday I am an itinerant working directly with kids. So I work at one of the poorest schools in the district, and I serve preschool, elementary, and teenagers. My teenagers are young men who've been incarcerated. They're all sex offenders, and they're sweet kids who are going through a lot of rehab. I really enjoy them. So in 1 day, I can go from sitting on the floor with 3-year-old Head Start kids to a table with elementary and then a bigger table with bigger kids. So it's an awesome job. There is my therapy room. We're a pretty old school. I love, like I said, what I do. And there's my room again, the outside, the inside. And there I am. Actually, I'm getting a language sample there from a boy, a Mexican young man, and I'm using the Rainbow Fish, the big book. The kids love that. It just gets them to talk. So that's a little bit of my own background and where I'm coming from in this presentation. So in terms of general assessment considerations, we know that more and more of our students nationwide are English language learners. And in terms of projections for U.S. population growth, Hispanic and Asian populations are especially growing. Unfortunately, a lot of us are here because a number of these students aren't succeeding as well as we would like to in graduating on time. And so what we're really looking at is the fact that poverty and being of English language learner status can make kids vulnerable. And so what we need to do is not over-identify them, but also we need to be careful to legitimately identify students who need the services. So this is Eddie, a 15-year-old offender who I just love seeing. I'm seeing him currently. Just a quick story, he was referred to me in May of this year for a lisp, and when he said, "Hi, Ms. Phileth, nice to meet you," I thought, bingo, you're on my IEP. And the social worker said, I think he has language processing problems. And so I talked to my boss and she said, he speaks Spanish, it's English language learner, don't worry about it. But the social worker was pretty adamant and I thought, okay. So I gave him a couple of information processing tasks, digit span and non-word repetition, and he really did poorly. And then I had him just read some things to look at his S sound and found that he couldn't decode polysyllabic words. So I pushed really hard, called my boss and said, I'll come in this summer. I really think there's something going on. Psychologists resourced me. We all tested. And this 15-year-old reads at a second grade level. And no one ever identified him because he was always tossed aside as just an English language learner. So I feel very strongly about our session today because of kids like Eddie. We've identified him. He will receive comprehensive extra services sophomore, junior, senior year of high school. And I'm thankful for that, but I wish we could have found him a lot sooner. So we're going to talk about strategies for how to accurately identify. We're going to do evidence-based practice. I will be citing some research studies to support all of the ideas that we're talking about. And we'll start on with kind of a definition. We know that for a language impairment in an English language learner, they've got to have low skills in both languages. And we need to be sure that the folks at our schools understand that if they're age appropriate in their first language and low in English, that's not the kids that we serve. We only serve those with genuine language impairments. So we have to ask the question when we get these referrals, is there a mismatch between the student's background and the school's expectations? It's my opinion as a practitioner that with Common Core state standards, it's become so much harder for kids, especially kids in poverty, that we're getting even more special education referrals. So that's something that all of us are facing. So I have the diagnostic pie, and you've got a copy of that. That's Asha so generously scanned a lot of materials. And it's important to share with teachers that we only see students in quadrants 3 and 4 who have genuine language impairments. And so you're welcome to Xerox that off if you would like and share that with your school. In terms of legalities, I find that really important for my principals and my teachers to understand. It's kind of tricky, lots of things that we have to consider in our assessments. U.S. Department Office of Civil Rights said that we cannot identify kids just for limited English proficiency, and we're all very well aware of that. The IDEA said that we've usually got a test in both the first language and in English, so that's very important as well. And then the IDEA says that we need to use a team approach and our assessment materials have to not be discriminatory. But one of the things that I find to be super good news with the IDEA is it doesn't require that standardized measures are used. We're allowed to use informal, non-standardized assessment, and it does leave the choice to us as individuals. The IQ performance discrepancy has been eliminated. There's a focus on early intervention. And along with that, the IDEA doesn't really specify, again, that we have to use formal measures. It says we can use a variety of measures. We just have to not rely on a single test. So legally, we can use those informal assessments. But a lot of us, I've talked to a lot of people in my travels who tell me that they're really pressured to use formal tests. And I use standardized tests myself, parts of them. So I want to talk a little bit about some considerations with that. The Native Americans have a saying, one of my former students, an Apache Indian, shared this, that when you're riding a horse and it dies, get off and find a new one. But a lot of us really do want to kind of keep, with the standardized. So that is my cat. She has a comfortable life, and we have a comfortable life with our typical referral and assessment procedures. Teachers refer, we get the signatures, give a couple of standardized tests, we get our scores, and we're off and running. And so what I want to suggest is that if we're going to do that, we look at the pitfalls of standardized tests. Most of them are developed from a Western literate middle class framework, and there are certain assumptions. And in terms of assuming that students will cooperate, I think of when I assessed Precious, and Precious wasn't. She was a very active little girl who pulled my hair and spit on me and swept my stuff off the table and kind of kept me humble in the midst of all this. She wasn't exactly cooperating, and so those tests were not valid for her. We assume that kids will attempt to respond and also understand artificial things like fill in the blanks. And then we assume, too, that students have been exposed to the information and that we can go get them from their classroom, bring them to our speech room, and they'll be comfortable with us as unfamiliar adults and verbally display what they know. And I cannot begin to tell you the number of times that has not happened for me. So when I test kids, what I try to do is start off with receptive testing, like maybe some vocabulary, some pointing, and not make them talk right away, and that often helps them to be more comfortable. I could be here all day about potentially unfamiliar items. Coming from the Philippines, I had not heard this Humpty Dumpty song. I didn't know what the Big Apple was. I thought it was a Big Apple. So there's a lot of items that kids might not be familiar with. And so keeping all that in mind, if we're going to use standardized tests, we're able to modify. We can give bilingual instructions with the help of an interpreter. What I like to do is give extra examples and demonstrations, because what I find for a lot of kids is if they're unfamiliar with standardized testing, which most of them are, if I give them one or two examples, they might not understand the task. So I'll give them 3, 4, 5 examples, and in that way they know what they need to do, and they're a lot more comfortable with that. So in addition, I give kids extra time. I score answers as right if it's correct in their culture. And then I've started doing more of repeating items when necessary. And so this has worked so well for me. This is my clinical experience, that if I'm testing an English language learner, and let's say I'm giving directions, right, like point to the yellow triangle, if the child gets it most of the time on the second attempt, they're often a typically developing student who just needs more time to learn English. On the other hand, if I will tell them, point to the yellow triangle, they don't get it. We do it again in English or the first language, and they don't get it the second time. Those are the students who usually end up qualifying under the label language impairment. So that's just something practical that I use a lot as a clinician. I omit biased items. I also test beyond the ceiling because I find frequently that kids know more, so I don't test till they cry. I try to avoid that, but test beyond the ceiling. And then I also will test in several sessions to increase their comfort level with me. And then I use conceptual scoring, like I'll count answers in both Spanish and in English. So there was a wonderful article that came out that talked about that. And so when I test a child, it's what this study did. If it's in Spanish, I'll say apunta a la pelota. And if they don't get that, I'll say point to the ball. And so I will count the answer in either language. And that's what they did in this study. So they looked at the impact of that on 5, 6, and 7-year-old Spanish English students. They administered standardized vocab tests, and they were conceptually scored. And what they found was when they counted answers in both languages, more children fell within the average range. And so that was just a really helpful research finding that, again, like I said, I do a lot myself. And then here's another very practical thing that I've really gotten, I think, a lot better at over time. If I'm evaluating vocabulary, and let's say this is in English, right? I mean, not that you're supposed to be asking an English language learner what pyramids are, but there you are. So if they don't know, we had one little girl say, oh, towers in the desert. And I'm like, that kind of rocks. What's this? A paw, a fluffy foot. What's this? Thermometer. That's a temperature. So if they give me answers that are related, then that's usually a really good sign that there's not a language impairment. Kids who have genuine underlying language impairments will usually give answers that are wildly off target or that are vague. So what's this? A stool. It's a stick thing. That's pretty vague. What's this? A typically developing child might say things you take on a trip, whereas the language impaired student will say boxes. So that's another thing I found to work real well. So when I interpret tests, I see if the answers are typical of other children from that student's background. It's always a team decision. And then because I modify standardized tests so heavily, I include disclaimers in my report. So let's talk about practical strategies and materials for informal assessment. So what should we do? We're going to talk about some how-tos now. And this is a toolkit for you. It's all supported by, research, by science, and these ideas can be used with students from any language background, preschool, elementary, and adolescent. So I've found that getting away from formal tests and using ecologically valid informal assessment measures is kind of like ziplining. I'm afraid of heights, so in Hawaii 2 years ago on the Big Island, I made myself zipline, and it's okay to start small, just with one of the measures that is included in this YouTube presentation. And eventually you can get brave and jump off that 3-story tower, and that's what I had to do on Zipline 7. That dinky speck is me dangling 1,000 feet in the air. It was awesome. I can't wait to do it again. But you can go more and more toward informal assessment as you get more comfortable, and you might even survive and come out smiling. I was in Florida recently, and this woman had heard me earlier this year, and then she came back a second time, always flattering, and she said, I tried one of your ideas, and she goes, it worked, and I was so stoked. So hopefully you'll feel the same way. So we want measures that are ecologically valid for the kids, and the assessment wheel that you have in front of you that Asha Scan demonstrates an ideal approach. We want to do case history, dynamic assessment, observations, RTI, and it does take time, but so often, if I'm willing to take the time to do a really good, thorough assessment, the child doesn't qualify, and I've saved myself hours of, IEP writing and all those things. So the assessment wheel, again, is there for you, and I hope that'll, help you to remember some of those strategies. We want to evaluate communication in a variety of settings, and so none of us have a lot of time. I don't do home visits. I wish I had time, but I'll often be there at bus duty. I'll pretend to be a playground duty. I'll go into the cafeteria, the classroom, and I'll observe that child. And then I use a pre-evaluation process, case history, questionnaires, and you've got that list of indicators, and I hope that you will really use that before you start testing, because I've ruled a lot of kids out who are typically developing by using this. And so what I do, it looks like, 4th of July meets Christmas. I interview the classroom teacher, the parent, the interpreter, and I ask the questions on the questionnaire, and I triangulate that data, and it gives me a lot of good information about whether the child is typically developing or has an actual language impairment. So I hope that will help you and guide you. Feel free to reproduce it as often as you need to. In this video, I give about a 10-minute demonstration of that. So in all your spare time, you're welcome to watch that. It's kind of fun. There's a wonderful new parent questionnaire developed by Johan Parody and her colleagues in Canada called the ALDQ. And just very briefly, they did a study, and it was awesome. It had 178 subjects. Kids had been exposed to English sequentially, 2 to 3 years of age. All the parents were refugees or immigrants. And the purpose was to say, if we do a parent questionnaire and English testing, can we distinguish language difference versus disorder? And so all the subjects were acquiring English, and they were from a huge variety of backgrounds. Some were low income. And the measures that were used were the parent questionnaire, CTOP Nonword Repetition subtest, the TEGI and narrative assessment, and the P-body. And the results were that the typically developing children scored higher than the language impaired kids on every measure except for the knowledge-based P-body picture vocabulary test. And so what succeeded in this study was non-word repetition, tense morphology, and the results of the parent questionnaire. So I call this the Mother Knows Best study. And what I found is what they found, is that if parents are concerned, especially if the child is lower than siblings in the first language, there's almost always a language impairment there. So that's another kind of strategy that I use specifically. I also use the informal measure of oral language skills to get a language sample. A lot of times I'll work with an interpreter, and they'll do it in the first language, Punjabi, Spanish, whatever. I'll do it in English and compare answers. And this has been very, very helpful. What I find is, and my friends have found too who've used this, is that if you ask a child, okay, what is this? A clicker. What do you do with it? The kids with language impairments fall down on the what do you do with it question, invariably, even if they're older. So if they're vague in giving the function, that's a real red flag. And so you've got that, and you're welcome to reproduce that and use it as often as you need to. One thing, if you've got an interpreter working with you, remember that research has found that bilingual students with language impairment have difficulty with verb tense in their first language. So I will say to the interpreter, are there problems with grammar, to get to that if I possibly can, and that's been found across languages. So there's a YouTube demo that you can look at if you would like to that shows how to do that. I also like to evaluate rapid automatic naming skills, and I'll never forget a student who was Hispanic, low income, second grade, very good oral English, but was reading maybe 10 words per minute when he should have been reading 100 words a minute. And what I found with him was that it was rapid automatic naming where he fell down, and he turned out to have a very serious reading disability. So that worked out real well. I've also begun looking more at associated motor behaviors, and if I hear reports of that or if I see it during my screening, I run right to psychologists and the resource specialist and tell them, and then a lot of times that gets them on board with testing that child and finding that indeed there is a learning disability there. And then I'm a huge fan of information processing and working memory tasks. Language impaired students really have difficulty with that. And the really good news is that the research from 1998 to 2015 is consistent, that across the languages, if kids have a true impairment. We know that because of information processing, working memory difficulties, and we can use those measures with children as young as age 2, which is awesome. I get questions all the time. What do you do for preschool? This. So I'm excited to share with you some handouts that Asha scanned for you, and you're welcome to Xerox those and use them. They're what I used with Eddie, my 15-year-old, where you can assess digit span, non-word repetition, real word repetition with children from any language background. So Dolligan and Campbell started this, finding that non-word repetition, nonsense syllables, was a good indicator. There's been some other studies that have had similar findings, and I have them there for you. This was a real kind of landmark study, Swanson and Sines, where they found that Spanish-speaking students with average intelligence but at risk for reading disabilities had difficulty with Spanish measures of short-term memory. And then there was a wonderful, more recent article, a huge meta-analysis, where what they found was that children with genuine language impairment were very low on non-word repetition tasks, and that differentiated difference versus disorder. So this is an awesome YouTube video. If I know your time's limited, this would be the one I would totally look at, because you watch Jai and the look when he starts to stumble, and that's the look I see every single time a child has difficulty with working memory. Despalter et al. 2013 found that with Italian children, non-word repetition tasks differentiated language impaired from typically developing, and so it was very sensitive, again, in Italian-speaking students. And then Guiberson and Rodriguez looked at preschool Spanish-speaking students, and they administered a Spanish non-word repetition subtest to language impaired and typically developing, and they found that non-word repetition was successful with these little kids in knowing who had a language difference and a language disorder. And then Brandeker and Thordododer, 2015, looked at French and English, non-word rep and vocabulary, testing children in English, French, and both. And what they found was that vocabulary scores were affected by previous exposure. Non-word repetition was not impacted. And so the takeaway was that even in 2- and 3-year-olds, these underlying mechanisms of non-word repetition rely on short-term processes, not vocabulary knowledge, therefore screening out the effects of environment. So it's really uplifting to know that we can use those with little kids. So those measures don't depend on background, they're quick and they're easy, I promise. I found Eddie, my 15-year-old, in under 5 minutes when using the measures that I'm giving you right now. So again, if they have difficulty, there's probably an underlying language impairment. So it really these tasks really minimize environmental and previous experience. And people often ask, well, is there a formal test out there? And there is. The CTOP2 is awesome. I love that when I use it. And there's some other good subtests on there. I also like the token, and I've got a video. It's crazy to watch this because the girl is being evaluated in Arabic, which none of us, or at least most of us, don't understand. But if you watch the child with her latencies and difficulties following directions, it's pretty obvious that there are issues there. Dynamic assessment is also awesome. It looks at a child's ability to profit from instruction. Asha's got a great website that provides a tutorial for that. And what I ask for dynamic assessment is, what does this child require that's different than things that are working with similar ELL peers? So RTI uses that, and basically if kids show treatment resistance to that extra help, usually they end up qualifying for therapy. So RTI helps to prevent problems and catch kids, hopefully before they end up needing special ed, and Asha's got some great information about that. So very briefly, one of my friends works in Santa Ana. We're the biggest port of entry in the country for Hispanic families. So many preschool referrals, it would have cost $2 million to treat all those kids, and she didn't have that. So she created an RTI program, and at the end of the RTI program, only 5% of the students needed IEPs. So it was awesome to see that the language lab benefited the children, the parents, and worked really, really well. And the parents ended up, doing more language stimulation, and again, fewer kids on IEPs. So that was awesome. So very briefly, just to hit on some intervention, I have an instructional continuum you've been given. I find that this is really helpful for teachers to know that I personally, and a lot of us in California, don't really see kids for assessment until they've had Tier 3 instruction, intensive help in the classroom. And if they've had about 6 months of that and they're still not getting with the program, then we'll test them for special ed. So the language of intervention, we need to hopefully support both languages, introducing new concepts in L1 first and reinforcing those in English. And Conert stated that our goal is to effect positive change in both the first language and English so that children are successful in all environments. Fabulous new article, Mendez et al. 2015, where they found that with young Spanish speakers, teaching in dual language mode helps skills in both Spanish and in English. So I get this all the time. What if a child has Down syndrome, autism spectrum? They can be bilingual also. Fabulous new study with Chinese students with autism spectrum disorder. They were confidently bilingual, and that did not negatively impact them. So this study concluded that these students with special needs can and do become bilingual. Very important to not tell parents to speak only one language at home. We really encourage them, where I'm from, to speak in that first language. So again, more research finding that even kids on the autism spectrum benefit from bilingual intervention and bilingualism in the home. I'd like to conclude by talking just a pinch about what I do for therapy. I will go get the kids from their classrooms, and I'll have them bring their language arts books, and in that way I'm able to connect with the Common Core. So we use the current story that they're working on, and we do, articulation, fluency if they need that. I get vocabulary, and we define that, and I write the definitions on the whiteboard. So that's something that's practical and quick and easy, and has worked very, very well for me. And the teachers love it, the kids benefit, and again, it relates to classroom, and it helps with Common Core. I like to teach the language of test taking, and you've got that handout in front of you as well. And then I'll conclude with my children's literacy program. You've got the website there. I've got a Facebook page, Love Talk Read. I collect books to give to kids at risk to build their literacy skills, and you can do the same. I've been privileged to collect a lot of books and give them to families, and that's been a real privilege to do. So we've covered a lot of things. We've looked at assessment, practical strategies, language of intervention, and a couple of brief therapy ideas. So thank you for all that you do to help our children succeed. It's been great to be with you. Thanks.